All right, so today we're going to start the Civil War, the true turning point in U.S. American history. We really do date U.S. history kind of as before the Civil War and after. And we're going to kind of explore why this is happening as we kind of march through this content. Here we start with a picture of Mr. Abraham Lincoln, a little blurry. Of course, to his right is General Ulysses S. Grant. So two luminaries of U.S. History, two presidents of U.S. history that are all going to be very, very active during this fight. Now, let's put the Civil War in context. The Civil War is unlike any other. Lasts 4 whole years, actually not quite 4 years. 640,000 Americans will die in the war. 3 million will fight in the war. That is 1 in every 25 American men. The Battle of Antietam is going to be the single bloodiest day in American history with 23,000 deaths. That is 10 times the amount that died in Pearl Harbor. All right. And this death toll will include the sum of every other war. So 640,000 would be the sum of every other war combined. So World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, etc. You add them all up and it equals under 640,000. In fact, I think that the Afghanistan war has just recently pushed us over. But still, a mind-boggling amount of death for its time period, especially given the fact that the United States only has 31, 32 million people total, right? So this is an astounding amount of death and destruction that happens completely on the U.S. continent. The war ends with a signal of a triumphant industrial society over an agricultural one. We'll move firmly into the American Industrial Revolution as a result of the Northern victory of this war. And the agricultural agrarian ideal of Thomas Jefferson will be forever abandoned, besides in little small pockets of national consensus. Everyone predicts a short war. Some even say that, just one battle will get the job done. Certainly no one thinks it's going to last more than a year. And of course, as we now know, everyone is going to be wrong. Now, let's talk about how this gets started. Okay, remember December 20th, 1860 is the date that South Carolina seceded. And South Carolina will be quickly followed by 6 other states, including Tennessee. Tennessee's not there. Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana. Okay, and all of this will happen more or less before any actual shots are fired. South Carolina secedes before Abraham Lincoln is even inaugurated. All right. But with that comes a conflict off the coast of Charleston in Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is a federal fort, a garrison fort by the Union, of course, and it lies inside of Charleston's harbor. And, when South Carolina secedes, all of the federal troops who have been in Charleston are kind of forced to retreat back to Fort Sumter, which is where their actual territory is. The commander at Fort Sumter is going to be Major Robert Anderson. He's a former slave owner, but he's of course loyal to the Union. And he has a job of making sure that the fort is equipped and supplied. And, he basically has to take care of his troops that are underneath his control. Now, that poses a problem with Charlestonians, and they do not feel like they need to allow the fort to be resupplied, especially with ammunition. Now, a Star of the West, which is a ship, has 200 soldiers and supplies, and it actually tries to get in and is fired upon and turned back at Fort Sumter. And so still, the fort remains unsupplied. Now, what happens is Lincoln sends a message to the governor of South Carolina saying, hey, we're going to send in just supplies, so not ammunition, just food. If you attack, though, then we will send in ammunition and we will fight. And so basically, he doesn't want to look like the aggressor. He doesn't want to provoke the South. But by saying we're only sending in food, he basically kicks the ball into the court of Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy and says, hey, if you fire on us when we're just bringing in food, then you are clearly the aggressor here, right? Which is actually a pretty brilliant maneuvering of Abraham Lincoln. And sure enough, Jefferson Davis, seeing that the fort is going to be resupplied, cannot stand for it, right? He cannot allow the fort to be resupplied, and he attacks. And so on April 21st, 1861, That's the night that the Confederate artillery will open fire on Fort Sumter. Um, it'll be commanded, the artillery will be commanded by General Beauregard, and he's actually an old student of Anderson. And for 36 hours, he bombards the fort, and eventually it falls, although with zero casualties except for a Confederate horse. Now, who has the upper edge? Okay, who is the favorite on paper? Well, the North is, right? Completely the North is in almost every way except just a few. Population, the North has 21 million people in 23 northern states. The South has 9 million people in 11 Confederate states, including 3.5 million slaves. So, from a sheer population standpoint, it's absolutely mind-boggling how many more people the North has. The Confederacy only has 1/9 the industrial capacity of the North, but the North produces 97% of all the firearms, 96% of all the train locomotives, 94% of the cloth, 93% of the iron, and 90% of the boots and the shoes. So, in terms of the actual things you need to fight the war and transport troops, the North crushes it. The South just absolutely crushes them. The military leadership would be one area that the South has an edge. 7 of the 8 military colleges are in the South. Most of the trained military officers are from the South. Remember, the Southerners are not sending their kids up to Harvard and Yale and Princeton, all those other old New England schools. So they send them instead to military schools, right? And so the South is just full of amazingly well-trained military leaders. At the same time, though, the North has the naval edge, maybe not necessarily in training, but certainly in ships. The North could easily blockade the South and basically suffocate them into giving up. And that's why later, when we talk about potential British intervention for the South, that's going to be super, super huge. The morale in the North is going to be worse initially than in the South. The South, of course, is fighting for what they see as their way of life and their institution, their peculiar institution. The North is just trying to keep the South in the Union, right? Not necessarily a very admirable cause, especially because in the beginning the war is not about slavery. So we don't want to necessarily think that Abraham Lincoln is deploying troops to make sure that slaves go free. We have said that a major cause, if not the cause, of the whole fighting is slavery, but we can't necessarily say at this point that people are joining, the armies in the North to go and emancipate slaves. 4 more states would join the Confederacy after the fall of Fort Sumter, and these include Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, bringing the total up to 11. Notice that some of the states that have slaves are not there, right? Kentucky, for instance, not there. Maryland, not there. A new state will be formed in West Virginia as it kind of peels off the other part of Virginia, because those communities, mostly in the Appalachian Mountains, will not be willing to fight with the rest of Virginia. They just don't simply own slaves, and they see no reason to leave the Union for an institution that they do not support. The South's greatest strength, of course, that we've mentioned one of their greatest strengths will be the fact that they have really amazingly well-trained leaders. But the other massive strength, and the biggest strength, is that they're fighting a defensive war, right? They don't need to attack at all. They can just basically repel the North and they win. Okay, so they need to basically outlast this war of attrition, kind of chip away at the morale of the North, and by doing so, maybe the North would just give up. The South can also produce all the food that it needs, so it never needs to import food from anywhere else. The Union, though, has to invade the South, conquer it, and occupy it in order to win, which is tough to do. The South is obviously a very large geographical area extending all the way from Virginia southwest to Texas. So this is a very, very tough enterprise. And remember, in the Revolutionary War, the British try and do it, and they don't do it very well. They don't do it at all. They cannot have the luck that the British had. The North can't have the luck that the British had, and expect them to win this war. Still, the North looks better on paper, as you see in kind of some of these charts. Right, there's the population, there's the factory numbers. North looks definitely better on paper. But remember as well that the British looked great on paper too, and we all saw how that worked out, right? The United States was able to fight a very effective war of attrition against the British and kind of foil all of their military maneuvers. Now, the actual first pitched battle, the first major battle isn't going to happen until the summer of 1861. Actually, we'll pull this Wikipedia page up real quick so you can see some of the numbers. And the reason why it takes so long for this to happen is because both of the commanders of the armies are trying to get their troops into position and figure out where the actual fighting will occur. Richmond, Virginia will become the new capital of the Confederacy. It is actually quite close to Washington, only 100 miles away. So, the idea is that, okay, our capitals are this close, so why don't we just fight a battle in the middle, and whoever wins it will decide, right? If only it were so easy. But still, the first battle does take place in between the two. And the commander of the Union forces is going to be General Irvin McDowell. He doesn't really want to fight in the initial engagement. He waits 3 whole months in order to actually put his troops in the field. And what we have here is what seems at the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Battle of Manassas Junction, and we'll get over why there's 2 names in a minute, go over that rather, is, McDowell will have a rather large army and will meet Beauregard, the same leader from Fort Sumter, 25 miles outside of D.C. Initially, the South has to retreat, but is reinforced by Stonewall Jackson and other fresh troops that are kind of pouring in literally after they hear that the fight is starting and kind of swell the ranks of the South as they retreat. And this ends up becoming a major win for the South. And it propels Stonewall Jackson to mythology in the South. He saves the day, right? He's the guy that has these fresh troops. He tells his troops to yell like furies, and this is known as the rebel yell to strike fear in the hearts of the enemy. Kind of reminds you of the yell of the Scots soldiers in their wars with the English from way back when. And so the South wins, right? They rout the North. And this is kind of a shock. And also 4,800 people are killed, wounded, or missing. One of the amazing things about this battle, and we see this in this picture, is that many journalists and well-to-do people come out and have picnics next to the battlefield to watch this pitched battle kind of take place, and they're quickly run off of their perches as they see the retreat, first of the South and then of the North, and many of these people realize, oh, this is actual war. Maybe I shouldn't be out here, having tea and crumpets or whatever, watching men get blown to bits with new and better artillery and weapons. Of course, this increases the morale for the South. They win their first battle well out of the heart of the Confederacy and strike kind of a decisive blow for themselves, repelling the North out of the South. McDowell will be relieved of his command. He'll be replaced by General George McClellan. He's the head of the new Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, or at least the main branch of the Union Army, and he will not fight for another 7 months. So a lot of reluctance to fight in at least major battles in the initial stages of the war. Now, the naming of the battles, like I mentioned before, is interesting. The South is going to name battles after towns, and the North is going to name battles after waterways. So that's why we get the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas. Now, usually what I've found is that if the North wins a battle, okay, so you would expect if the North wins the battle that it would be named after a waterway, right? Or that the South won a battle will be named after a town. That's not necessarily the case. At least not in terms of how it's been disseminated down through history. The Battle of Gettysburg, for instance, is a major victory for the North, and it's named after a town, right? So it's interesting how we've gotten these names kind of as time has gone on. And we usually see that whoever wins the battle actually names it. The name that kind of sticks is from the other side that lost. So interesting little facet about namings there. The North responds to this defeat by trying to raise 1 million troops, absolutely incredible number, up from the 90,000 that Lincoln calls in the war's beginning. And what we're going to find out here is that war is going to be completely different. This is a whole new kind of battle with new weapons, accurate rifles, artillery, etc., massive armies that can move on railroads. And so pitched battles with lines of soldiers, right, trying to outmaneuver, outflank each other is not effective, right? We'll see the first use of major trench warfare here. And massive, like we said before, massive casualties. Now, what are people fighting for? Okay, this is more than just fighting for the North or the South, right? Fighting for region. It's fighting for beliefs. And really, what we mentioned before, it's fighting over both the ways of life and the culture, and of course, much of this culture is based on the institution of slavery. Okay, abolitionists like Wendell Phillips will believe that it's God's, purpose to make sure that the North wins, right? This fight to end slavery is a dictated moral mandate from God in order to free the world of slavery. Okay, I love this quote from Phillips here. The community which does not protect its humblest and most hated member in the free utterance of his opinions, no matter how false or hateful, is only a gang of slaves. Wow. If there's anything in the universe that can't stand discussion, let it crack. Okay. On the other side, we have Robert E. Lee, right, and the Southerners who are fighting for their states, are fighting for their rights. Robert E. Lee doesn't want to secede, but he thinks that the federal government is stealing rights from the South, and so he fights against what he perceives is, basically a grab of rights away from the states that the Constitution is trying to protect. And both sides use the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence to uphold their own beliefs, right? President Lincoln says that he's fighting to preserve the Union and fighting because he said if he didn't, it would be a betrayal of the Declaration of Independence. But the Southerners also feel like they're fighting to preserve the Declaration of Independence, right? They basically, the viewpoint is, from the South is that the Declaration is supposed to foster a spirit of freedom, of independence, and that the federal government cannot infringe upon that. Whereas the North is saying the Declaration of Independence guarantees individual liberties and union, right? So the perspective from which both sides are fighting, they're claiming the same document, but their interpretations are wildly different. The Southerners also, right, are fighting to preserve their way of life. They cite the Bible once again as kind of a backup for preserving their fight. And they say the industrial world of the North is going to be soulless and that it has no place in the South, and that they would rather necessarily, they want to engage in the modern world per se. They're completely fine with the institution of slavery. If it kind of fizzles out, then oh well. They don't want to be pawns in the industrial machine, which, to be fair, the industrial machine of the North is pretty miserable. But still, the people who work there are not property. They are human beings at the end of the day that are more or less free to move about the country. All right, so that's going to be it. We'll get to Antietam later. Feel free to answer your questions. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks so much.